This is the history of 19th century banking in 1 hour is a topic. I was given this topic because I've written a lot about this in parts of several books and in a couple of journal articles. And so I'll give it a try. It's one thing that makes it kind of relevant is just last week, I think it was last week or the week before, when Ron Paul quizzed Bernanke at the House Financial Services Committee hearing. One of the comments that the Fed chairman made was that the Fed was supposedly an improvement on the unregulated banking system of the 19th century. And that was a statement of shocking ignorance from someone who claims to be an economic historian. That's what Bernanke's claim to fame was in academia when he was a Princeton professor, his economic history. He claims to be an expert in the history of the Great Depression. And as I told a guy I met at a bar who found out I was an economist, I told him that Bernanke is an expert in an incorrect theory of the Great Depression. And so you can be an expert in the theory that the Earth is flat. There used to be a lot of experts on that, and that's sort of what Ben Bernanke is. But it's just shocking ignorance for him to say either that or he was just purposely lying. To say that there was an unregulated banking system in the 19th century, that was never true. There wasn't a Fed, but there was lots of government intervention. And so I'm going to start at the beginning. At the beginning of the American Republic, this is the late 18th century. As soon as the American Revolution was over, there was a political cabal in America that essentially wanted to adopt the British mercantilist system in America. And what was this system? It was a system, it was known as mercantilism in Britain and elsewhere in Europe. And it was a system of subsidies, direct and indirect, to politically connected businesses, a system of protectionist tariffs, and it was a system that was financed in part by the Bank of England, a central government connected bank. And so after the revolution was over, there were a lot of men in politics in America who saw that, well, this is how the elites in Britain became wealthy and powerful, and we want to be wealthy and powerful. The opposition to this was always Thomas Jefferson and the Jeffersonians. The proponents at that time was Alexander Hamilton, America's first Treasury Secretary, was the chief proponent of this, and he was sort of the intellectual brains, really, of the Federalist Party, the opposing party to Jefferson. And the Jeffersonians looked at this, and they correctly stated that we just fought a revolution against this system. Why would we want to adopt it here? And that was the point they were making. And of course, the answer, if they were to have been honest about it, by the Hamiltonians, they would have said, they would have quoted Mel Brooks in the movie History of the World Part 2, where Mel Brooks plays the King of France, and he keeps saying over and over through the movie, it's good to be the king. And so if you're on the paying side of a mercantilist empire, it's a bad deal. It might even be worth fighting a revolution to get rid of that. But if you're on the collecting side, it's good to be the king. And Hamilton and his cronies wanted to be the kings. And so they wanted to import this system, and the whole system was premised on the existence of a government-run bank, sort of similar to the Bank of England. So it would have been the British system imported to America. Alexander Hamilton himself coined the phrase the American system to describe this British system that he wanted to bring to America. And, of course, he grew up as a teenager. He worked for slave-owning molasses traders on St. Croix in the Caribbean. And that is sort of his educational background in economics. And so he observed how wealthy these men became as a part of the British mercantilist system. And he thought that was the route to wealth. He wasn't very well educated at all in economics. I don't think he ever even read The Wealth of Nations. In my book, Hamilton's Curse, I quote William Graham Sumner as saying the same thing. Sumner wrote a biography of Hamilton in 1905. And so what he knew about economics, what little he knew, I think he learned from sort of propaganda pamphlets that were written by people who worked for the British mercantilists who spread propaganda in favor of protectionism and these other policies. But it was his nemesis, Jefferson, who was well educated, who did read The Wealth of Nations. If you go into Monticello today, which is Thomas Jefferson's home in Virginia, right by the front door, the first thing you see is a marble bust of Turgot, the French finance minister, whose name is upstairs in the Mises Institute in the library, among the famous precursors of the Austrian school. And so it was Jefferson was well schooled in economics, and that's why he opposed the central bank. And so, well, here's what Murray Rothbard said about this. He wrote about this in his book, The Mystery of Banking. He said, as soon as the revolution was over, Hamilton was a part of a political cabal that was really headed by Robert Morris, who was probably the wealthiest man in America at the time. He was also a defense contractor during the Revolutionary War. He was a Philadelphia businessman. And here's what Rothbard said, that these people wanted, quote, I'm quoting, to reimpose in the new United States a system of mercantilism and big government similar to that in Great Britain, against which the colonists had rebelled. The object was to have a strong central government, particularly a strong president or king as chief executive, built up by high taxes and heavy public debt. The strong government was to impose high tariffs to subsidize domestic manufacturers, develop a big navy to open up and subsidize foreign markets for American exports, and launch a massive system of internal public works. In short, the United States was to have a British system without Great Britain. And that was Murray Rothbard. And then he goes on to say, an important part of the Morris scheme, he calls this the Morris scheme, was to organize and head a central bank to provide cheap credit and expanded money for himself and his allies. The Bank of North America was deliberately modeled after the Bank of England. That was really the first central bank. It was called the Bank of North America, and it only lasted about a year because its currency was, it had a monopoly on currency, a legal monopoly on currency issue, but it was so mistrusted that the currency became worthless in about a year, and it was privatized. But these people never gave up. Rothbard refers to, quote, Morris's youthful disciple, Alexander Hamilton. And he was his youthful disciple. And Hamilton was quite the, what would be the scientific term? The scientific term would be ass kisser, I think, for Alexander Hamilton. He was at a young age, he was 20 years old, and he's George Washington's aide-de-camp in the Revolutionary Army. And near the end of the American Revolution, when it was evident that the war was going to end, Hamilton writes a letter to Robert Morris, and the richest man in the country. And what did he write in the letter? Well, he didn't know anything about economics and finance, and so he asked a man named Timothy Pickering, who would later become George Washington's Secretary of War, who was known to know a lot about finance at the time. What can I read to learn at least the language of finance and economics? So Timothy Pickering gave him a few books, enough to allow him to write a 30-page letter to Robert Morris. And he pretty much said in the letter, and I quote the letter in an article of mine that's in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics, he pretty much said, Dear Mr. Morris, I agree 100% with your economic plan for a central bank, corporate welfare, protectionist tariffs, and a big public debt. And so that's why I said the scientific term would apply to Hamilton all the way. And so here's the richest man in America. The war is ending, and he has George Washington's top assistant writing him saying, after the war, we need to get all this done. We need to get all these things done. And so Robert Morris writes to George Washington and recommends, when he's president, when George Washington became president after the war, and recommends Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary. And according to Ron Chernow, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Hamilton, George Washington then turned to Hamilton and said, I didn't know you knew anything about finance. We never talked about it. But he appointed him as the first American Treasury Secretary because Robert Morris said so. And Robert Morris, after all, he must know something about money. He's the richest man in the country. And so that's how he became first Treasury Secretary. This was very similar to today. When's the last time you heard of a Treasury Secretary who was not the head of Goldman Sachs? So Robert Morris was the Goldman Sachs of the day, who represented the Philadelphia and New York banking industry. And so he put his man, as his puppet, became the first Treasury Secretary. Well, here's what Ron Chernow actually says. He said, Hamilton brushed up on money matters and had Colonel Timothy Pickering send him some primers to read. Hamilton sent a marathon letter to Morris that set forth a full-fledged system for shoring up American credit and creating a national bank. And so this letter laid out their agenda, and the agenda was subsidize corporations directly, protectionist tariffs, a big public debt, and a central bank to pay for it all. And the big public debt was closely linked to the idea of a bank, a central bank. Hamilton himself was very Machiavellian in this, and the reason he gave for a large public debt being a virtue, he called it a blessing. That's why I called my book Hamilton's Curse. There's another book out called Hamilton's Blessing about the public debt being a blessing. Why Hamilton thought it would be a blessing was that the wealthiest people of the country would own the government bonds. Therefore, they would become a powerful political lobbying force for higher taxes to make sure there was enough money in the Treasury to pay off their bonds. And he wanted to link the wealthy to the government, just as today we link the poor to the government through welfare. He wanted them to be a permanent lobbying force because he believed the Constitution did not create nearly a big enough government. You have to understand that at the American Constitutional Convention, Alexander Hamilton appeared, and he laid out the plan of the Nationalists, as they were called. It was a permanent president who would appoint all the governors, who would have veto power over all state legislation. So it would be a king, essentially, and there would be no such thing as federalism or states' rights. It would be a monopoly government in the nation's capital. And of course, that's why the Jeffersonians said, well, it sounds like the King of England. Why would we want that? We just fought a revolution against that. Okay, and so the purpose of the central bank was to fund all this. And here's so I'll tell the story. Well, here's what another thing that Hamilton had in mind. This is a quote from Douglas Adair, and he was an editor of the Federalist Papers, which makes the case for the U.S. Constitution. So Douglas Adair, in 1980, this is a 1980 edition of the Federalist Papers, describing Hamilton's role in all of this. He says, and I'm quoting, with devious brilliance, Hamilton set out by a program of class legislation to unite the propertied interests of the Eastern Seaboard into a cohesive administration party, that is a party of government, while at the same time he attempted to make the executive dominant over Congress by a lavish use of the spoils system. In carrying out his scheme, Hamilton transformed every financial transaction of the Treasury Department into an orgy of speculation and graft in which selected senators, congressmen, and certain of their richer constituents throughout the nation participated. That's his description of Hamilton as Treasury Secretary. He was building big government by using his post as a patronage office to buy the allegiance of various members of Congress for his agenda of bigger government than the Constitution would allow. And so one of the first things Hamilton did was they nationalized the war debt. Okay, the individual states had financed the war through tax collections and issuing debt. So there was all these bonds that many of them were held by Revolutionary War veterans who were paid in government bonds when they ran out of money. And at the time, a lot of them were trading for as little as 2% of par value. And so Hamilton and the insiders in the U.S. Congress passed a law saying that these bonds would be redeemed at a certain date at 100% par value. And so the insiders knew this, but this was before the internet, remember? This was way before the internet. And so what happened was the insiders, the political insiders, including Hamilton personally, hired ships, stagecoaches, every means of transportation available at the time to go up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States to buy up all these bonds at 2 to 10% of face value, because they and only they knew that in a couple of weeks they could turn around and sell these bonds back to the government at 100% of face value. Here's how there's a biography of Jefferson and Hamilton by Claude Bowers, a famous historian who explains what happens. He's explaining this scene. He says, expresses with very large sums of money on their way to North Carolina were going for purposes of speculation in certificates. They splashed and bumped over wretched winter roads. Two fast-sailing vessels chartered by a member of Congress who had been an officer in the war were plowing the waters southward on a similar mission. So there was this mad dash to go and buy up all these bonds from these unsuspecting bondholders. And they did. And Bowers writes about how Robert Morris himself made about $35 million at the time through this arbitrage that happened. Talk about insider trading. This is political insider trading, the first big example of it. And so here's Jefferson observing all this. And at the same time, Hamilton is writing a big report to George Washington arguing that a bank run by politicians out of the nation's capital is constitutional. Jefferson went back and said, well, the Constitutional Convention debated this and rejected the idea of a bank. And that would seem to be pretty conclusive evidence that it was not constitutional. It's not in the Constitution. It's not part of the delegated powers of the Constitution. Hamilton at that point, Alexander Hamilton invented the idea of implied powers of the Constitution. He said, yes, it's not an explicitly delegated power to the central government, but if you read in between the lines, it's implied somehow. And Jefferson's view was that if you read in between the lines, you'll see blank space. There's nothing there. That was called strict constructionism, and it still is. But Jefferson smoked out Hamilton on this of why he wanted a bank here, and we did get the bank. The two men wrote reports to George Washington. But the way we did get the first central bank, it was called the Bank of the United States, was that George Washington owned a lot of land in Virginia. It's known as Mount Vernon now, his property in Virginia. And they were moving the national capital from New York to Virginia, Washington, D.C. And George Washington wanted the national capital to be adjacent to his property. And so they cut a deal. George Washington said, if you redraw the boundaries so that D.C. is adjacent to my property, I'll vote for the bank. And he did. So that's how we got the first bank of the United States. It wasn't on the strength of the arguments of Alexander Hamilton. It was just a real estate deal that benefited George Washington. And so that's how we got it. But here's how Jefferson smoked out the purpose of this bank that Hamilton wanted. This arbitrage opportunity, it was used to dish out special favors to members of Congress who would then vote for Hamilton's agenda of corporate welfare, subsidies for road and canal building companies, cheap credit for businesses mostly in the Northeast, protectionist tariffs that he wanted. They had to buy the support of Congress, and this arbitrage over the nationalization of the debt was their vehicle for buying votes. But here's what Jefferson recognized. Jefferson called it he said, Hamilton's financial system had two objects, and I'm quoting Thomas Jefferson here. First, as a puzzle to exclude popular understanding and inquiry. That is, it was so complicated sounding that the average person would have no way of understanding it, and that is certainly true today. And secondly, as a machine for the corruption of the legislature. So he understood that what he was all about in advocating a bank is he wanted a mechanism for corruption. Here's another thing Jefferson said about Hamilton. He said he avowed the opinion that man could be governed by one of two motives only, force or interest, self-interest. Force, he observed, in this country was out of the question, and the interest, therefore, of the members of Congress must be laid hold of to keep the legislature in unison with the executive. And with grief and shame, it must be acknowledged that his machine, political machine, he means, was not without effect. That even in this, the birth of our government, some members were found sordid enough to bend their duty to their self-interest and to look after personal rather than the public good. He's talking about the arbitrage and the money they made. And the big problem facing Hamilton, said Jefferson, was that this was only a one-time scheme. This was only a one-time vote-buying scheme. What he really needed was a permanent engine of corruption, because they nationalized the debt once. You can't nationalize it again. They already had it. You can't play this game over and over again to buy votes from a member of Congress. And so Here's what Jefferson said: "Some engine of influence more permanent must be contrived. This engine was the Bank of the United States." So in Jefferson's opinion, the whole case that Hamilton was making for the first central bank, the Bank of the United States, was that it could be used as an engine of corruption. And then later on, many years later, Hamilton died in 1804, and in 1818, Jefferson wrote an article recalling a dinner that he had with John Adams and Hamilton himself and a few other prominent people, where John Adams, the former President John Adams, made the statement that he said, he's talking about the British Constitution. He said, "Purge that Constitution of its corruption and give to its popular branch equality of representation, and it would be the most perfect Constitution ever devised by the wit of man." So if you get rid of the corruption in the British government, it would be the most perfect Constitution in the world, John Adams said. At that point, Hamilton interjects and objects to this and said, no, he said, no, the corruption in Britain is a virtue, not a vice, because it's that corruption that keeps government growing and getting bigger. You need some corruption to have bigger government. He actually said that. At this, in Jefferson, in this article, he says, "I swear on the graves of my children that this is the true story." And so I think it's apparent, because the first Bank of the United States was tremendously corrupt, as was the second Bank of the United States, and we did get the first Bank of the United States, and in the first 5 years, it created 72% price inflation in the first 5 years, and it was used to influence politics, to an attempt to institute politics, and it did so much of this. It created so much economic instability and price inflation that Congress did not renew its 20-year charter. It was given a 20-year charter in 1781, and then it became defunct. But then the War of 1812 came, and so in order to monetize the war debt, it was brought back in 1816. So we had the second Bank of the United States. And so we're into the 19th century here, and we start the 19th century with government banking. So Ben Bernanke was dead wrong when he said he equated laissez-faire and 19th century banking policy. The second Bank of the United States, here's Murray Rothbard's explanation of one of the driving forces for the recreation of the Bank of the United States. Rothbard says this in his History of Money and Banking in the United States: "The second Bank of the United States was pushed through Congress, particularly by Secretary of the Treasury Alexander J. Dallas, a wealthy Philadelphia lawyer and close friend, counsel, and financial associate of Philadelphia merchant and banker Stephen Girard, reputedly one of the two wealthiest men in the country. Girard was the largest stockholder of the first Bank of the United States, and during the War of 1812, Girard became a very heavy investor in the war debt of the federal government. As a way to unload his public war debt, Girard began to agitate for a new Bank of the United States who he could sell his bonds to." And so that was one of the moving forces behind why we got the second Bank of the United States. Nothing, no market failure story was even attempted to be told about the second Bank of the United States. And so we got this monster back, and this is 1816. And who here knows the title of Murray Rothbard's doctoral dissertation at Columbia University? The Panic of 1819. And so you don't have to be an econometrician to make the argument that causation equals, that correlation equals causation. But Rothbard explains why there is causation here, that the bank was brought back in 1816, inflated the currency, created a boom, and the boom busted in 1819. And so you had the first massive unemployment in American history in the cities, where you had, he writes of how in Philadelphia, the employment went from 9,500 to 1,500 people during the Panic of 1819. And that was the first really large-scale unemployment. And so the second Bank of the United States came off with a big bang, creating a boom and bust and price inflation at the same time, roughly doubled the price level in a couple of years after the War of 1812 was concluded. Okay, so and people all over the country knew about this. And so the Second Bank of the United States started opening up branches all over the place, and the people of Ohio were especially upset about this. They were especially upset about the fact that this corrupt machine was appearing in their state. And so at one point, the Bank of the United States opened up 2 branches in Ohio, state of Ohio. The state of Ohio then imposed a $50,000 a year tax on each branch. And this is where eventually the Chief Justice of the United States, John Marshall, made a statement that the power to tax is the power to destroy in one of his decisions. And what he was referring to is the power to tax the Bank of the United States is the power to destroy it. Marshall was a proponent of the Bank of the United States. He was slavishly devoted to Hamilton and Hamilton's ideas and Hamilton's political agenda. He was a nationalist like Hamilton. And of course, the people in Ohio said, well, yeah, that's right. That's the whole purpose of this tax, to tax it out of existence, to shoo it away. And so the state of Ohio attempted to collect this tax, $100,000. So they sent an armed marshal to the Bank of the United States office with a big chest, carrying a big hope chest, with him to put all the loot in. And he did. He crawled up over the counter, with his guns on his hip, and took $100,000 out of the vault and carried it off to the state treasury. And this sort of thing led to lots of litigation, and other states did the same thing. For example, Indiana and Illinois amended their state constitutions to prohibit the Bank of the United States from operating there. North Carolina, Georgia, Maryland, Tennessee, and Kentucky imposed heavy taxes, just like Ohio did. And their purpose was to get rid of this thing. And of course, this is a good example of how the central government sets itself up. They have this constitution, but of course, the politicians who are appointed to be black-robed deities, Supreme Court justices, sorry. Of course, they always support the government. And so John Marshall goes out there and says, the Bank of the United States is constitutional. It's not unconstitutional. But in those days, we Americans didn't look at the Supreme Court justices as black-robed deities who would announce, like Moses carrying the 10 Commandments from the mountain. They didn't treat them like that. They treated them like just another gang of politicians. Andrew Jackson was president at the time, and he pretty much said, thanks for your opinion, John, but my opinion is different, and we have 3 branches of government, not one. We have the executive branch, which is me, the president. We have the Congress. They have equal say on constitutional matters, and then we have your judicial branch. And then we have the people of the states on top of that. And that was the thinking in America at that time. And so, it wasn't written in stone. So of course, as a result, Jackson did veto the rechartering of the second bank. There was a famous battle. The best book on it is called Andrew Jackson and the Bank Wars by Robert Remini. I guess I could print his name here. That's the author's name, Andrew Jackson and the Bank Wars. And then here's what Jackson said in his veto. When he vetoed it, this is part of Andrew Jackson's veto of the Second Bank of the United States. We're into the 1830s now, in the 19th century. It says, it is to be regretted that the rich and powerful too often bend the acts of government to their selfish purposes. Distinctions in society will always exist under every just government. Equality of talent, of education, or of wealth cannot be produced by human institutions, but every man is equally entitled to protection by law. But when the laws undertake to add to these natural and just advantages artificial distinctions, to grant titles, gratuities, and exclusive privileges, to make the rich richer and the potent more powerful, the humble members of society who have neither the time nor the means of securing like favors to themselves have a right to complain of the injustice of their government. If government would confine itself to equal protection, it would be an unqualified blessing. In the act before me to recharter the Bank of the United States, there seems to be a wide and unnecessary departure from these just principles. and that's Andrew Jackson. So he was recognizing that the bank was being used as an engine of corruption. And the bank proved it, too. During the battle, the bank was financing the political careers of proponents of the bank. Daniel Webster, I quote Daniel Webster as writing a letter to Nicholas Biddle, the head of the Bank of the United States, as saying, if you want me to continue my support of your bank in Congress, you better send me my stipend. So he was literally being paid. Henry Clay resigned as Secretary of War to be the general counsel for the Bank of the United States because he had $45,000 in personal debt in 1825. $45,000 in 1825. He was known as a big gambler, Henry Clay. So in 2 years, he made more than $45,000 in legal fees from the Bank of the United States, being their lawyer. And so all of that proved to a lot of people that, well, this is an engine of corruption. But that, of course, is exactly what Hamilton wanted. So he was doing exactly what he wanted to do. And so the bank was defunct, and we had this era from roughly the late 1830s until the 1860s with no central bank. It's sometimes referred to as free banking. The government deposit of treasury of revenues, tax revenues, it was called the sub-treasury system. And all during this time, the Whig Party was created around the same time, right? The early 1830s, and one of their top objectives was to bring back the Bank of the United States. It always was. And in my writings of Lincoln, I quote Michael Holt from the University of Virginia. He's a historian who wrote a big fat book, The History of the Whig Party. It's about this thick. And he says that no member of the Whig Party was a more vociferous proponent of bringing back a central bank than was Abraham Lincoln. And he made stump speeches all the time for candidates who were running for office who were central banking proponents. And in fact, Lincoln himself, when he was in the state legislature in Illinois, there's a story about him told by David Donald. David Donald is a Pulitzer Prize winning biographer of Lincoln. He taught at Harvard for many years. He just retired a few years ago, David Donald. And his book is called Lincoln. And one story he tells in there is that in Springfield, Illinois, there was a law that had suspended specie payment. And so the Illinois banks could inflate. And this law was about to go out of existence on December 31st. And so if the legislature went home, January 1st, now the banks were required to have gold and silver, mostly gold, and redeemable for currency that they had issued. And Lincoln and the Whigs wanted to prevent this. They wanted to keep the suspension of specie payment in. They didn't want it to end. And so the story David Donald tells is that Abe Lincoln himself, this is in the 1830s, he was already the leader of the Whigs in Illinois. He bolted for the door because if they couldn't vote to adjourn, they couldn't adjourn. They had to have a quorum to vote on everything. But the Democratic Party had placed marshals at the door and locked the door, couldn't get out. So Abe Lincoln literally jumped out the window, and David Donald said that the Democrats then started calling him Leaping Lincoln. And his merry band of followers. And the other Whigs supposedly did the same thing. They jumped out the window. And when I was in Springfield, Illinois a couple years ago, and the old State House is still there. It's a museum now. And so I walked over there to see, and that was a long drop. I saw the window he dropped out of there, and but he was 6'5", so he probably could have hung by his fingers and dropped down and did it. But it tells you how, even early on. In my book, The Real Lincoln, I quote Lincoln's speech when he first entered politics. I could paraphrase it. He says, "My politics are short and sweet like the old woman's dance." And he said, "I'm in favor of a high protectionist tariff, a bank, and subsidies for internal improvements. That is corporate welfare for railroad companies." It was called internal improvement, and that's it. That's what he said. That's why I'm in politics. But the bank was the key. The bank was what to pay for all this stuff. And so, and of course, Murray Rothbard explains what suspension of specie payment means. The thing that the Whigs, like Lincoln, spent their lives trying to get in the 19th century. And here's what he says in What Has Government Done to Our Money? The bluntest way for government to foster inflation is to grant banks the special privilege of refusing to pay their obligations while yet continuing in their operation. While everyone else must pay their debts or go bankrupt, the banks are permitted to refuse redemption of their receipts. That is redemption for gold. At the same time, forcing their debtors to pay when their loans fall due. So you have to pay up when your loan falls due. But if you go to the bank, the same bank, and say, I'd like gold for my money, they say, get lost. The hell with you. The usual name for this is a suspension of specie payments. A more accurate name, says Rothbard, would be, quote, license for theft. For what else can we call a government permission to continue business without fulfilling one's contract? Okay, so when you put your money in the bank says, we'll give you gold when you want your money back. And then a year later, the government says, oh, we're going to suspend specie payment. And the bank says, no, we're not going to give you your gold, the gold that you gave us for this currency, for these pieces of paper. License for theft. And that's the sort of thing that Lincoln and the Whigs fought for. And so by the time you get to the 1860s, we didn't get, someone answer that phone, please. By the time you get to the 1860s, none of this had succeeded. The Jeffersonians had thwarted all of this. President after president after president had vetoed banking bills, tariff bills. 1857 was the high watermark of free trade in America. The tariff rate was as low as it ever was in the 19th century. There was no central bank. There was no federal subsidies for railroads or anybody else. There had been some state subsidies, but they were all such disasters that every state had amended its constitution to prohibit the use of tax funds for the corporations to do anything. And that all changed during the Civil War when the Lincoln administration enacted the National Currency Acts and the Legal Tender Acts. They created the greenbacks that were not backed by gold at the time, or silver for that matter at the time, allowed them to print money. During the Civil War, the price level doubled roughly in the northern states. In the southern states, did the same thing, but on a much greater scale. Inflation was like 2,000% a year in the southern states during the Civil War. In the Legal Tender Acts, monopolized the currency. They imposed a special tax on any existing competing currencies. And the Secret Service was created to police that. The origins of the Secret Service was to police counterfeiting, competition, in other words, for the greenbacks that were created. And so we didn't get a central bank per se, but we moved a big step in the direction of the nationalization of the money supply nevertheless. And so, it's yet another reason why Bernanke doesn't know what he's talking about when he refers to the 19th century as some sort of laissez-faire period in banking. And I'll read to what a few people said about this. This was a huge victory for the Hamiltonians who had morphed into the Whigs and then the Republicans by the 1860. And here's what, let's see, page 1. Let's see. One more quote here. Yeah. Well, maybe it's a tough quote, but the Republicans were ecstatic about this. I can read you one quote from some of the ecstatic Republicans. Oh yeah. There's a historian named Heather Cox Richardson. She wrote a book called The Greatest Nation on the Earth. How arrogant is that? It's about America during the Civil War years and the domestic policy during the Civil War, greatest nation on the earth. She quotes John Sherman. Senator John Sherman was the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee. So he was very instrumental in getting the National Currency Acts passed. He was the brother of General Sherman, the military general. They're both from Ohio. And here's what he said that was the Republican Party's objective with the National Currency Acts. He says it was, quote, to nationalize as much as possible, even the currency, so as to make men love their country before their states, all private interests, all local interests, all banking interests, the interests of individuals, everything should be subordinate now to the interest of the government. That's Senator John Sherman, chairman of the Senate Finance Committee and the most powerful man in Washington on economic matters during the Lincoln administration. And he, of course, was still in the Senate in 1890 when they named the antitrust law after him. So he was there quite a long time. Okay, and so there was an opponent. There was a Democrat named Lazarus Powell from Kentucky, a member of Congress. And here's what he said of the National Currency Act. The result of this legislation is to utterly destroy the rights of the states. It is asserting a power which is carried out to its logical result, would enable the National Congress to destroy every institution of the states and cause all power to be concentrated here in Washington, D.C. And of course, Alexander Hamilton, were he alive, would have said, well, sure, that's the whole point of this, is centralized power. The same with the income tax. When the income tax came along in 1913, it gave the government of Washington so much money that the states became just mere appendages because they could easily buy off any state government with all that money. The New York Times on March 9th, 1863, wrote an article about the Legal Tender Acts. They said this: the Legal Tender Act and the National Currency Bill crystallized a centralization of power such as Hamilton might have eulogized as magnificent. So that was always the game, to centralize power in Washington. That's how we got Hamilton's scheme of we don't have a permanent president, but they're all pretty much the same anyway. Whether the figurehead is Barack Obama or George W. Bush, they pretty much all work for Goldman Sachs and various other special interests. As far as that's who they always put in charge of the money anyway, and so it doesn't really matter. So we eventually did get Hamilton's highly centralized monopoly government, and the nationalization of the currency really was it. So what was the effect of these national currency acts? We did still have the gold standard after the Civil War, and there were periodic suspensions of specie payment. There were state governments that imposed all sorts of regulations, like branch banking restrictions on banks. That created problems a lot also. So there was not only federal regulation of banking, there was state regulation of banking. And there were some economists, some pretty prominent economists, who evaluated this whole system, the National Currency Acts, and what they did eventually. And Anna Schwartz was one of them. Anna Schwartz was, one of the most famous monetary economists of the 20th century. She just died a couple of years ago, if not a year ago or so. It's pretty recent. And she co-authored the famous book with Milton Friedman, A Monetary History of the United States. But there was a book of readings on monetary history that Anna Schwartz was the principal author of this one article. And this whole system that was enacted in the 1860s until the Fed was created in 1913, here's how they characterized it. As it was characterized by, quote, monetary and cyclical instability, 4 banking panics, frequent stock market crashes, and other financial disturbances. That's how they described it. So in other words, it behaved just like when we had the Bank of the United States, the first Bank of the United States and the second Bank of the United States. It created boom and busts, price inflation, stock market crashes. And so we had the same thing with government regulation of banking in the late 19th century, even without the Fed, as far as that's concerned. Okay, and so well, time is running out, but that's sort of my 1 hour rundown of 19th century banking and explanation of why Ben Bernanke is full of it when he says laissez-faire banking was improved upon by the creation of the Fed in 1913. And I think time is about up. I have oh no, we have time. I'm looking at the wrong thing. I think we have time for Q&A then. That's all I wanted to say. And if anybody has questions about anything. I can't answer questions about anything, but you can ask them.
I just want to say that Anna Schwartz is alive.
I thought she passed away. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. I think somebody told me she died. That's maybe they told me she retired and thought she was dead because she retired. I don't know. Okay. Well, that's pretty good. I like Anna Schwartz. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you
Yeah.
I was just wondering if you could comment on the book in general and if you like the way that they sort of set forth the history, if you found any problems with it.
I read it quite some time ago, and I thought it was a little too conspiracy theory oriented, even for me. And there was some bad economics in it. I would rely more on Murray Rothbard's monetary history of the United States. I think he knew orders of magnitude more about this than the author of The Creature from Jekyll Island, even though he probably had some things right. The Mises Institute has had two Fed conferences on Jekyll Island, and including one in the room where the Fed was created, and they have the pictures of all these guys who were the conspirators, and you walk into the room, and you can swear that the eyeballs are moving back and forth when you see all these big portraits of these people, and there's a big conference room there. But yeah, I wouldn't use it as a textbook in a classroom. You could read it if you want, but there are a lot better sources of the origins of the Fed than that one, because there's some bad economics in there that I didn't like. So it doesn't. But any book I read, though, I don't expect every book to be perfect. I read, a lot of the economic history research I do. I force myself to read dozens of really bad books, but there's always some good information in them. It's well documented, footnoted, and you can make use of it, and you can learn things about it, and if you understand economics, you can interpret some of these historical events differently from these historical authors sometimes. So I'm not saying you shouldn't read that book, but it's not one of my favorites on that whole topic. I think someone up here had their hand up next.
I can't help but think Alexander Hamilton. What was his idea with big government? He just wanted big government for the sake of big government. What interest did he have?
His question was, why did Alexander Hamilton want big government? One reason was his financial benefactors wanted it. They wanted a central bank that would subsidize their businesses, and he was their emissary to the government. And he was a lawyer, and the way it usually works is, once you leave the government, your law firm gets all kinds of business from those companies, and you become very wealthy. And so that's financial interest right there. And Hamilton also talked a lot about imperial glory. He wanted to invade France, for example, and he said it would give America imperial glory. And Hamilton, of course, Jefferson was terrified at this because he knew that all war was a waste of blood and treasure. And here he had Hamilton wanting a central bank to finance more wars. That's why, for example, when Jefferson was president, and the British started kidnapping American sailors and stealing American ships to help themselves out with their war with France, Jefferson had chose the lesser of two evils. He put a trade embargo on because the alternative was another war with England. And he thought a war with England would be an unmitigated disaster, whereas a trade embargo is just a disaster, an economic disaster. And he had to know that there would be a lot of cheating on the trade embargo anyway. But he was so anti-war that that's what he did. And so, but Hamilton wanted war, and you need big government for war. You need a lot of money for wars. He really wanted to invade France, and they had to work very hard to avoid a war with France right after the war with England occurred. And so he was quite the egomaniac, and I thought imperial glory was what he talked about a lot. He complained constantly to George Washington that we need a government of more energy. And if you read the biography of him by William Graham Sumner, he was the type of person that either did not understand or did not like the fact that the invisible hand worked pretty well. He thought that he had to have his hand in everything in the U.S. economy or else it wouldn't work. He was that type of person, and he had the authority. He was Treasury Secretary. And so he was sort of a compulsive central planner in terms of his mentality, if you read about him. Yes, sir. I think he had his hand up in the back.
On the opposite extreme from the Jekyll Island book, there's Greider's Secrets of the Temple.
Yeah.
Which one thing I find interesting about that is that he takes the monarchs to task consistently for the difficulty of implementing their sort of rule-based system, but fails to take the Keynesians to task for the difficulty of successful discretionary monetary policy.
Yeah.
Maybe you could comment on what you think of Greider's book.
Yeah, that's a pretty good summary of it, I think. Secrets of the Temple, yeah. I read it a long time ago when it came out, but I don't think, yeah, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good summary. I would agree with you there. Yes, sir.
In the 19th century, with all the meddling from the governments and first and second national banks, how quickly after those things resolved or after they were removed did the market stabilize and currency stabilize?
Well, they did stabilize pretty fast. After the Panic of 1819, the Fed, well, I won't use that, but the period when Jackson vetoed the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States, both Richard Timberlake is one of the few people who's written a treatise on monetary history of the United States. There's Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. There's Murray Rothbard's History of Money and Banking, and there's Richard Timberlake's book. And that's really the only three treatises there are on the monetary history of the United States. Alan Meltzer has written a history of the Fed, but it's not a monetary history of the United States, comprehensive. But Timberlake, in his book, says that period from the end of the Second Bank of the United States until Lincoln's introduction of the National Currency Acts was the most stable monetary system America ever had, even though it wasn't perfect. And Jeffrey Hummel says the same thing. Jeffrey Hummel's the historian who's written a lot on banking history. He had a real good article in the Journal of Libertarian Studies some years ago on this period of banking that he writes. He sort of repeats it in his book. He has a book called Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, which is about the Civil War, the American Civil War. But he has a big section on banking history in there that's drawn from his earlier publications. And so these are two pretty good monetary historians who make a good case that it wasn't a perfect monetary system, but it's probably the most stable monetary system that has ever existed in America. The critics of this era say that grossly exaggerate what were called wildcat banks. There were banks that said, well, yeah, we'll redeem our currency in gold, but you have to go to the branch bank out in Skunk Guts, Alabama, to get it. And this would be out in the middle of nowhere where only a wildcat would live, a mountain lion. But of course, people are not that stupid. If they say, we'll give you gold for the pieces of paper, we'll give you your gold back, but you have to travel 500 miles through the jungle to get it. They weren't that important. They existed. There were con artists who tried to set up banks like that. That's true, but it's a minor thing. It was a minor thing. But the critics of free banking always grossly exaggerate wildcats. They'll just say, "Didn't you ever hear of wildcat banking?" As though that existed everywhere, but it wasn't. It was a very minor thing, and it's really kind of dishonest for them to say that. But I think Timberlake and Hummel make a better case that this was more stable than any other system. It wasn't perfect, but it was pretty stable. Yes, sir.
I just kind of wanted to see what do you think are the differences, if any, between mercantilism and fascism?
Mercantilism and fascism. Well, I think mercantilism sort of morphed into fascism. There's an author named Michael Lind who wrote edited a book of essays on economic nationalism. And he actually says this, but he doesn't even realize that he's explaining how the mercantilist ideas of Alexander Hamilton eventually migrated to Europe and Japan. He even mentioned Japan and influenced the Japanese and German policymakers in the early 20th century. And so here, Michael Lind is a defender of economic nationalism and the Hamiltonian agenda. But in his book, he doesn't recognize it. He says it. He lays out the names of the people who advocated these ideas and brought them to Europe. Of course, they started in Europe, then they came to the United States, and then they went back to Europe because of Hamilton's influence and prominence, and also Japan. They became popular in Japan, sort of central planning. And so, economic fascism basically was private property and private enterprise was permitted, but it was heavily controlled and regimented by the state so that it would only serve purposes that would serve the state. Mercantilism wasn't that extreme in central planning. It was pretty much a system of subsidies, but it wasn't central planning. It wasn't the king didn't say, no, sorry, you can't make soap. We want you to grow wheat instead, or something like that. But that's what fascism was. It was you could have private enterprise, but it was only to serve whatever Hitler or Mussolini wanted it to produce. If they wanted to produce tanks and bomber aircraft, that's what you would produce with your manufacturing business. The mercantilism wasn't quite like that, but there is similarities. Yes, sir.
When Hamilton made the argument that corruption fuels big government and
Yes.
that's good, besides his own arrogance and desire for profit, did he try to make the argument that big government was good for society?
Oh yeah, he thought the question is, did Hamilton think big government was good for society? Well, he was probably as instrumental as anyone in getting the Constitutional Convention going to where the states seceded from the original Constitution. They seceded from the Articles of Confederation, which he had condemned as too weak because they did not give the federal government taxing power at all. All the taxes came from the states. And so at the Constitutional Convention, he wanted a king, a permanent president, as I said. And when he didn't get it, he stormed out of there. And when the Constitution was finally ratified, he denounced it as a frail and worthless fabric. Those are his words. And so even though he was the author of the Federalist Papers, and he said all sorts of nice things in the Federalist Papers, he spent the rest of his life trying to subvert the Constitution. And I describe how he did that in my book, Hamilton's Curse. And so he thought the government needed to be much bigger and more powerful. He wanted a standing army. Jefferson did not. Jefferson fought him tooth and nail over a standing army because Jefferson understood, as everyone did at that time, that the standing armies of Europe were always used to intimidate the citizens. They weren't defending them against invaders. They were intimidating the citizens to pay taxes. They were essentially an army of tax collectors. And that it convinced me that was true of Hamilton when I read about what he did during the Whiskey Rebellion. There were farmers in Pennsylvania that were growing wheat, and Hamilton, as Treasury Secretary, was instrumental in putting a special tax on wheat. And these farmers were making whiskey out of wheat, out of grain, because they decided it was too heavy and cumbersome to grow wheat and transport it across the state to Philadelphia and New York and sell it there from western Pennsylvania. And so they made whiskey instead. And then there's a special tax on whiskey, the whiskey tax. And they thought they were being discriminated against, so they revolted. Hamilton talked George Washington into conscripting, getting governors to conscript 15,000 men to ride up to western Pennsylvania to put down the Whiskey Rebellion. It was called the Tax Rebellion. And in Claude Bauer's book about this, the officers were all bondholders from the Eastern Seaboard, but the soldiers were conscripts. So they went up, and Hamilton himself rode up there, and they finally rounded up about 24 tax protesters, made them walk clear across from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia in the winter, some of them with bare feet, and they put them on trial with Hamilton as the judge. He decided he wanted to hang them. George Washington pardoned all of them. And so the tax protesters won the tax protest. They didn't pay the tax and they didn't go to jail. But that's what convinced me that the reason why Hamilton wanted a standing army was a standing army of tax collectors, just as existed during the American colonies. That was one of the big complaints in the Declaration of Independence. He has sent swarms of officers to eat out our sustenance. That's what Hamilton wanted. He wanted swarms of officers to collect all of his taxes. He imposed a personal property tax that created the Shays Rebellion in New England. The whiskey tax created another tax rebellion, and so he was a hyper energetic statist who didn't believe anybody could get along without his control and his finger being on their behavior. And he needed a lot of tax. He was a Machiavellian too. There's even a book on Hamilton called The American Machiavelli about him, and so that's who he was. And he was he was very brilliant. He must have been sort of a Svengali type character, because I've read what John Marshall says about him, and it's a lot of John Marshall's writings, the Chief Justice, sound like a 13-year-old girl writing about her first boyfriend. It's kind of sickening. And even John Marshall's famous statement on the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States, big passages of it are verbatim from Alexander Hamilton's report on the bank to George Washington, the exact same words in both things. And so he was really slavishly devoted to his agenda. And that's why there's a good book, Ranks American Presidents, by Ivan Eland. It's called Recarving Rushmore. And he gives John Adams a very, very low ranking among all the presidents for two reasons. He signed the Sedition Act, which made free speech illegal in America, and he appointed John Marshall as Chief Justice. And so Ivan Eland says for those two reasons, John Adams should be like number 48 or something of all the presidents, way down there in president. Let's see, I think we're about out of time. It's 2:30.